The Fujifilm X-E4 versus the X100VI. If you could only have one of these two cameras, you'll probably side with the X100VI. But with this being back ordered everywhere in online camera stores and super high prices in other marketplaces, you may consider the X-E4 instead. So in this video, I'll be comparing both of these guys and sharing my experience using them as a casual user. Up until last month, I've been using the X-E4 while waiting for my X100VI to arrive. And until now, I've had a fair share of time with both. Both of these got some pretty decent weight to it as they're both made of metal. One of the things that you'll notice with the X-E4 when you get it in the mail is that it's just the body itself, unless you get the kit lens with it. The X100VI, however, is a fixed lens, a 35mm full frame equivalent f2 or 23mm f2 lens. When you look at the button layout, the X100VI definitely gives you a little bit more buttons to use versus the one on the X-E4. But they're pretty negligible, like you wouldn't really notice unless you use both of them like I have. In terms of the X-E4, one of the things that you'll notice is that it has a very nice, smooth and loose shutter speed dial. Versus the one on the X100VI, which is just a little stiff. You can really get your thumb around it or your index finger around it, but I find that I have an easier time with the X-E4. However, one of the perks that the X100VI gives is that it has a ISO dial. If I go ahead and pop up the shutter dial, I can go ahead and manipulate the ISO nice and easy. I usually leave it on C for the custom. But on the X-E4, this thing doesn't have a dedicated ISO dial. Instead, I have to press the button in and switch between shutter speed and ISO. Because of this, I end up just using auto ISO and just use the front dial for shutter speed if I really want to. In terms of usability, one of my favorite things about the X100VI is that when I'm going about my business and taking photos, I can go ahead and use this joystick, press the center, and it'll reset the single focus point in the middle. However, there is no such option here with this joystick in the X-E4, so that's kind of a bummer. So usually I have to tap the center of the screen or really use the joystick and put it back in the middle. If you know a workaround for this, leave it in the comments, but I have not found any solution to that. If you look closely at the bodies, you probably won't notice it, but the X-E4 is not weather sealed, whereas the X100VI is. So that's something to consider if you're gonna go out and take it out to the elements. Typically I'm not, maybe some light rain, but I'm not intentionally shooting in the weather like that. Both of these have tilting screens, but the X-E4 allows for a little bit of a wraparound here for like a vlog style kind of selfie screen going on, whereas the X100VI does not provide that option. Despite that unique feature, both of these cameras do have a 3-inch screen for us to use, and the X100VI body is just a little bit wider than the X-E4, but you won't really notice when you're actually using it in the field, or even if you pull them out, you know, side by side. In terms of ports, they're on the same. It's just the X-E4 is located on the left and the ports on the X100VI is on the right. They got the USB-C connection, the micro HDMI cable port, not so great, and then the 3.5mm jack here, or at least the 2.5mm jack here for us to use for a camera remote or for a microphone. If you're interested in using the viewfinder, this X-E4 only has an EVF, or electronic viewfinder, and it's about 2.3 million dots. But if you like using an optical viewfinder like a DSLR camera or the old style, or I think the X Pro series of Fujifilm cameras, then you're gonna like the X100VI. This provides 3.6 million dots for us to use in terms of focus. Overall, these camera bodies are practically the same. They got their exposure compensation dials, they got their special button here up in the front, they got the shutter button, but the X100VI does have this unique kind of like button in the front. And this is where you're able to program an ND filter to turn on, but a little bit more on that later. In terms of other things that are internal with these cameras, the X-E4 has a 26 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, whereas this Fujifilm X100VI has a 40 megapixel BSI sensor. And this is going to be more favorable if you want to take, or if you are going to take wide photos or, you know, wide angle photos and then crop in later, versus the X-E4, which gives you that same option, just not as much flexibility. In terms of video, the X-E4 allows for up to 200 megabits of video recording, and the X100VI provides up to 720 megabits per second worth of recording. If you're someone who desires unlimited recording, the X-E4 is not going to be your choice. Whereas the X100VI is unlimited, you just need to go ahead and keep this powered on if you plan to keep this going on and on and on. Plus, another thing about the X100VI is that if you're gonna go out and shoot in the daylight, but you don't wanna go ahead and crank up your shutter speed, you can apply up to 4 stops of ND filter built into the camera. So that's pretty neat, because I'm just not a fan of sticking ND filters on in front of my lenses and having to unthread them later on and all that hassle. But if you're not that crazy about ND filters, one thing you will go crazy for is the in-body image stabilization. The X-E4 doesn't have that. The X100VI is going to be able to provide IBIS not only in video, but also in photo, which allows for a much stable, cleaner image coming out of your camera when you're using slower shutter speeds, especially when you're in low light situations. Personally, I don't do too many of those, but it definitely comes in clutch when I go ahead and use it. If anything, I like to utilize the IBIS when I'm shooting handheld video and I'm just trying to keep as stable as possible using 3 points of contact, and I just pretty much act like a tripod. But aside from IBIS, what are the things that really separate these two cameras? Well, for one, the Fujifilm X100VI does provide a built-in flash. I just don't use it. Both of them include film simulations. This is just a little bit smaller, but if you really want more features, you're probably gonna lean on the X100VI. By the way, if you don't want to use the flash that's built in, you can also attach flashes on either one of these. Both of these can use app control with the Fujifilm app. I'm just not a fan of it, even for file transfers. I would rather just import my photos using SD cards and an SD card reader. Stepping away from the spec sheet, what are these cameras like when actually using them? Side by side, back and forth, I can't really notice a difference between using these cameras except for the shutter dial, which is again loose on the X-E4 and a little stiff on the X100VI. The shutter ends up being a little louder on the X-E4. That was the X-E4. This is gonna be the X100VI. It's just so quiet. So if you take photos and say like church, the X100VI is gonna be a better vote. But in general, if you're trying to get better face autofocus and eye autofocus, both of these are gonna do the job as they both have that feature. But the X100VI does have some AI features built into it in terms of focus. You're gonna be able to focus on things like animals, trains, planes, and birds, I believe is one of them. So if that's something you're interested in, then maybe that's just a little extra perk for you to go ahead and get this camera. Or you can go ahead and stick to the X-E4 and use tap to focus, which is okay too. If you're someone who shoots sports or even just kids running around and playing, both of these cap at 1/4000th of a second with mechanical shutter. Anything faster than that is gonna go ahead and utilize the electronic shutter. The max shutter speed that you're gonna get out of the X-E4 is 1/32,000th of a second with 8 frames per second in burst shooting. Whereas with the X100VI, you're able to get 1/180,000th of a second. That's crazy. And you're able to get up to 11 frames per second shooting in burst mode. But if you're using electronic shutter, then you're gonna get even more frames per second. Overall, when using these cameras, I'm just using these for day trips, when I'm going out on dates with my wife, or even just having a good time with my friends. I'm able to utilize both these cameras while still being able to stay in the moment and not be carried away with what gear I'm gonna pack or what gear that I'm using, or even taking away from the moment from other people just looking at me, look through my camera, taking photos instead of being there with them. Then afterwards, when everything is said and done, I'm able to go ahead and import these photos and send them out through AirDrop or iMessage, whatever, and everybody's pleased with how their photos came out. Most of these photos never touch Lightroom, but I do capture RAWs just in case, but for the most part, I'm really not even editing them. Now, although there's no such thing as a perfect camera, there's not too many things that I could say against these. Sure, the autofocus could be a little bit better. Yes, I wish that these things were just a little bit easier to grip straight out of the box and I wouldn't have to buy all these accessories like a thumb grip and a hand grip. But overall, for the price and value that I get out of these cameras, I can't really complain. And you know, for what I bought them for, I'm not out here really to discriminate against either of these two cameras or to even trash talk them, because I'm just grateful that these guys exist and that I don't have to depend on my world-class Sony cameras to do everything. Sony cameras are great, but they still make me edit by the end of the day, and I don't want to touch Lightroom as much as possible. And these cameras provide that value that I'm looking for, while still being able to be in the moment with my friends and family. As good as Sony is, they have their place. But these Fujifilm cameras have their own place for their own particular use in my day-to-day life. But let's stop beating around the bush. What's this gonna cost and what's this gonna cost? The XE4 is $849 body alone, original MSRP. But you're gonna most likely find this on eBay because they no longer sell the XE4 on the online stores. So you're probably gonna look upwards of like $1,100 in the used market from somewhere like eBay. The lens that I ended up sticking on the XE4 is the TT Artisan 27mm f2.8, which is like a 40mm full frame equivalent. And that sits around $149. The autofocus is pretty decent, the image quality is pretty decent, and for what it is, it's much better and practical for me than going and buying the Fujifilm version, which I think is either $300 or $400. The X100VI, it's $1,599 US. So what kind of person is buying what camera? The XE4 is most likely for those people who want to go ahead and get a simpler camera, who don't want those XT series or just want a little bit more choice as far as lenses are concerned, because this is an X mount. You're able to go ahead and buy either the biggest lenses or the smallest lenses for this form factor. And if anything, you're willing to shop in the used market to be able to get one of these, or even buy something like the XE3. But you side with the XE4 because you're getting that latest sensor for this series. Who's buying the X100VI? It's the people who do want the latest sensor. This does have the latest, I think, X-Trans sensor, the 5th generation, which is also the same sensor that's going to be in the X-T5, which is one of their premium cameras that have a dual SD card slot. Oh, by the way, these two cameras only have one SD card slot, so that's just something to keep in mind if that's important to you. But in general, you're buying this because you're not only buying into the hype, but you're buying one of the best cameras from Fujifilm despite the trade-offs. You want the latest thing, you want the great film simulations, you want the 40 megapixel camera, and you just want to be minimalist about your carry. You're locking into this focal length. You're not buying any more lenses. If anything, you buy the adapter like I did. And they also have a wide version as well. Overall, if you're willing to pay the higher price tag, the X100VI is definitely worth it. And it's worth the wait if you have it pre-ordered already. But if you want to go ahead and put this aside, you won't be upset with the XE4 either, because it's almost the same experience if you haven't had the X100VI or the X100V before it. All I know is before you consider either of these cameras, do consider the accessories that you're gonna go get with it. Right over here.